For more than 70 years, France controlled the heartbeat of Africa, not through armies or flags, but through money. The CFA franc, a currency born in the ashes of colonialism, dressed up as cooperation, but engineered to keep entire nations economically chained to Paris. For decades, it worked. Every market transaction, every import, every public budget from Dakar to N'Djamena passed through invisible hands in the French treasury. France called it stability. Africans called it what it truly was, control. But something has changed. The old order is collapsing. And for the first time since independence, Africa is rewriting the rules of its economic destiny. This is the untold story of how France lost Africa and how the CFA empire finally began to fall. It begins in 1945, just after World War II. France, broke and battered, faced a crisis. It could no longer fund its colonies the old way. So it invented a new system, one that would allow it to rebuild, using Africa's labor, raw materials, and trade. They called it the CFA franc, short for Colonies Françaises d'Afrique. The idea was simple. All French colonies would use one currency, pegged to the French franc, later the euro. In theory, it would guarantee stability. In practice, it ensured dependence. Under the deal, 50% of every African nation's foreign reserves had to be kept in the French treasury, in Paris. France would then manage those funds and decide how much each country could use. It was a colonial system disguised as cooperation, a velvet rope wrapped around Africa's economy. For decades, leaders who challenged the CFA were silenced, exiled, or worse. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso, called the CFA a tool of imperialism. He urged African nations to create a new currency, controlled by Africans, for Africans. Months later, in 1987, Sankara was assassinated. His death sent a chilling message to other African leaders: don't touch France's money. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, the CFA zone expanded, covering 14 countries across West and Central Africa, from Senegal and Ivory Coast to Gabon and Cameroon. France had built a financial empire that stretched across the continent, without a single soldier. To the outside world, the system looked stable. Inflation was low, the exchange rate fixed, and the French guarantee made investors comfortable. But under the surface, resentment was boiling. African economies grew, but the profits flowed outward. Every export, every loan, every financial transaction fed the French banking system. Africa produced. France profited. By the mid-2010s, the illusion began to crack. A new generation of African economists, journalists, and youth activists began asking questions. Why did independent nations still depend on a former colonial master for their currency? Why were billions of African dollars sitting in European banks, earning almost nothing, while local industries starved for investment? Why did France, a nation thousands of miles away, still have a seat in African monetary boards? These weren't whispers anymore. They were rallying cries. In the streets of Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Dakar, protesters carried placards that read, "Down with the CFA." Africa must control its own money. The youth were awakening, and this time, France couldn't ignore them. Then came the shockwaves. On December 21, 2019, during a joint press conference in Abidjan, Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara announced the future end of the CFA franc and a transition to a new currency to be called the ECO. The agreement would drop the requirement for African central banks to deposit half their reserves in Paris and remove the French representative from regional monetary boards. Critics called the reforms symbolic. But the message was clear. The colonial financial ties were unraveling. Africa News +2, Al Jazeera +2 behind closed doors, France began to panic. The CFA wasn't just a currency. It was leverage, the last major link connecting France's global influence to its former colonies. Losing it meant losing billions in trade access, diplomatic leverage, and control over African central banks. And as France's economic footprint shrank, another player moved in: China. Through loans, infrastructure, and investment, Beijing began offering African nations what France never truly did: partnership without oversight. To some, it was a new form of dependency. To others, liberation by opportunity. But one thing was certain: France was losing Africa. Across West Africa, new economic ideas flourished. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta's transitional government announced it was rethinking all monetary and trade ties with France. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré called for a sovereign currency that would serve the people, not foreign banks. In Niger, a new alliance of Sahel nations openly discussed forming a regional central bank independent from France and the West. The language was changing. No longer development aid, no longer partnership. Now sovereignty. And for France, that word was terrifying. As the CFA's future hung in the balance, France launched a charm offensive, diplomacy, promises, and PR campaigns to remind Africa of their shared history. But for millions of Africans, that history was precisely the problem. In online debates, African youth dissected the past with precision. How the CFA kept their parents' salaries low, how their government's reserves built French wealth, how independence was never truly achieved. They called it economic colonialism 2.0. And in a digital world where TikTok and YouTube spread information faster than propaganda, France's narrative began to collapse. Le Monde.fr+1 The breaking point came not from speeches, but from silence. As Sahel nations expelled French troops and closed military bases, France's response was muted. It could no longer dictate the terms. When the new juntas announced plans to leave the CFA, France couldn't stop them. The symbolic foundations of French Africa, its currency, its influence, its prestige, were evaporating. In December 2023, reports emerged that the West African Monetary Union was moving to phase out French oversight of its reserves entirely. The CFA, once a symbol of control, had become a symbol of shame. The Times +2 Reuters +2, but this story isn't just about the fall of a currency. It's about the rebirth of a continent. In markets from Bamako to Abidjan, traders now discuss exchange rates not in fear, but in hope. Economists in Accra and Lagos debate what a Pan-African digital currency might look like. Students in Ouagadougou proudly wear shirts that read, "The CFA is dead." It's more than money. It's identity. And as African nations pivot toward new alliances, BRICS, regional blocs, and digital innovations, they reproving something powerful. True independence begins when you print your own destiny. In France, politicians still argue that the CFA brought stability, investment, and discipline. But history will remember something else. It will remember the farmers who sold their crops for coins that lost value overnight. It will remember the workers whose wages were decided in Paris, not at home. And it will remember the leaders who dared to say no and paid the price. For decades, France believed it could manage Africa's economy indefinitely. But the continent has changed. Its people are younger, more informed, more connected. They don't just demand freedom, they understand it. And that makes all the difference. Today, the CFA franc still circulates, but its power is fading. The new alliances of the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are laying plans for a shared sovereign currency. Senegal and Ivory Coast, once France's loyal partners, are exploring regional reforms. The walls are cracking. The empire is crumbling. The CFA, once the invisible chain that tied Africa to Europe, is rusting away. And in its place, a new vision is emerging, one of an Africa that no longer trades dependency for stability, one that defines its own value, not by Western approval, but by African progress. The story of how France lost Africa is not just about economics, it's about awakening. It's about nations discovering that the greatest wealth is not gold, or oil, or aid, but control. Control of resources, control of production, control of currency. And once that control shifts, so does power. From Paris to Bamako, from the Élysée Palace to the streets of Ouagadougou, from the past to the future. As night falls over the Sahel, the French tricolor no longer flies above African skies. But a new symbol rises, the African sun, burning bright and free. The age of the CFA is ending, and a new era is beginning. This is not just the story of how France lost Africa. It's the story of how Africa finally found itself.